We can use conditional formatting in order to identify trends in our data. We know that. I want to show you this example to identify a couple of challenges that you might run into. Here we have our sales revenue for each month for many different years, including the total down below. What if we wanted to identify the maximum value before a downturn occurs? That is, our sales seem to keep increasing, but then they'll decrease in some given month. So what's the max before a downturn? I might come here and select my data. I'll start here down at H19 and select my data going up to illustrate a point. I'll hit conditional formatting and new rule. I'll write a formula of my own. And you can see here that we can type in equals C9 less than C8. So essentially, if the next value is lower, then go ahead and highlight the current one. I'll set a format here, and we'll just do a bright yellow. I'll say OK. That doesn't look right. What's going on here? Well, the rule was written for the one that's currently selected. So it really depends on how you've selected your data. It's not always going to be the top left corner, but usually is, because usually you start your selection from there. Let me go ahead and back off that rule. I hit Control Z to do that. And let me now write that same rule, but with the correct selection. I'll come down here, create a new rule, use a formula, and we'll say C9 is less than C8. We want to highlight it, and we will select that bright yellow. And as we apply it, okay, that looks good. We have increasing values till April, when, in May we go down. Increasing values through August, we go down in September, etc. Okay, so that looks pretty good. However, what happens if we want to do just the opposite, maybe highlight the lows, kind of the restarting points? How would we do that? Well, we have a couple different challenges there. Let me actually come up and delete our rule first. Go ahead and delete our rule. Looks like I had a superfluous one left in there. If we want to highlight the low point instead of the high, let's do it this way. Let's go ahead and select these values. Notice I'm not selecting January because I want my rule to be written for this cell. And if this cell is lower than that cell, then I want this cell to be highlighted, so the rule needs to be applied to it. I'll go ahead and click conditional formatting, new rule, write a formula, and my rule will be the same. C9 is less than C8. Then I want it highlighted with that yellow color. I'll say OK there. And now it looks like the low point ends up being highlighted. Oh, but look, I've left off January. What am I going to do about that? Well, essentially, I'll just write another rule that looks and makes the comparison differently. So in this case, I'll go ahead and highlight this and hit conditional formatting, add a new rule, use a formula. But what is my formula going to be now? Well, it's being written for this top left cell. I'll say if D8 is less than D19, then go ahead and highlight it and use the same format that we used before. Apply that. And now we can see some trends in our data. You might say, well, why didn't you highlight, January for 1997? Well, it's because I really don't have anything to compare it to, and so I didn't apply that rule to it. So we can see some trends here. Looks like we always have a low point of the year here in May, and a downturn again in November, and then in January of each year also. Can really help us to understand some of our data. Okay, let's go on to the next tab. In this tab, we're trying to look for positive changes. So we have a pre-test and a post-test, pre-Jedi test and post-Jedi test, and we want to highlight everyone that's improved, including their name. How are we going to do that? Highlight everything that we want to eventually highlight. We'll add a new conditional formatting rule. We'll write our own rule. And what rule will we write here? Well, essentially, we want to say if the post is greater than the pre, then highlight it. But we want to highlight it for everything. So what we'll do is we'll end up, letting the row vary, but we'll keep the column absolute. So in other words, if we say D8, or in this case, we can just click it, D8, and then hit the F4 key so that the row is not absolute. If $D8 is greater than, click over here in C8, and let's make sure that the row is not absolute, then go ahead and highlight it. And we'll choose maybe this bright green right there. We'll apply that, and as the rule is applied down the rows, then the row number ends up changing. We'll say OK and OK there, and you see that Jorge, Scott, Ryan, Zach, and Chester have all increased their scores. So with just a little bit of intuition, we can actually apply rules that apply to whole rows or whole columns at a time, which is pretty nice. Doesn't have to necessarily occur in the cell that you're highlighting. All right, let's go over to hide errors. Sometimes you'll find sheets like this where there's calculations that are done, and you don't want to necessarily delete the formulas for these calculations, but they kind of make the spreadsheet messy, so you want to hide them. Yeah, we could wrap everything in an if statement. If it's an error, then don't show it. Otherwise, show the answer. But that's actually a little bit of work to do also. We can use conditional formatting to make this better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, and I'll use conditional formatting to just hide the errors. So I'll come up here to conditional formatting, down to new rule, and I'll use my own formula here again. What formula will we use? Well, there's a function out there called the isError function. So we can say isError, and what are we writing? Which cell are we writing this formula for? Well, it looks like it's this B6. So if B6 is an error, then what do we want to do? Well, we can be a little bit clever, and we can just change the font color to match the background color. In this case, we'll come over here to the font, and for the color, looks like we're just white on white here. We'll just go ahead and change that white. Of course, if your background were a different color, you just match the background color. And we say OK, and we say OK, and all of a sudden, those pesky errors look like they're gone, but indeed they're still there. The formulas are for when we get the appropriate data and it can do the calculations. So we can use conditional formatting to, quote, hide information if we need to as well.